Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Board Masters with me, Chris Mullins, and today I'll be doing a video that I'm very excited about, and that is my top 10 video game adaptations that I would love to see. And I'm excited about that. Obviously, if you've seen any of my footage, I probably talk about it way too much. I've come from a video game history as opposed to, I'm very new to board games, and it's something that I've talked about in a number of videos in terms of like how the ratings are treated differently between the two communities and why there are very few adaptations that are really highly rated on BGG, and those videos are in the playlist, the Conversations playlist that this one is in, so if you want to check them out, feel free. And I will stress these aren't my 10 favourite video games. I do love most of these, but I've tried to sort of think about ones that may translate well to a board game as opposed to, as I said, just my favourite ones, because a lot of them wouldn't. And, you know, because I'm quite new to the hobby, it may not be as in-depth in terms of the board game gameplay aspects, and, you know, I may be wrong or not have the knowledge necessarily of the different types of games of how it would translate. So please engage down below in the comments and we'll have a conversation about that, because I want to learn basically. And I'm not going to start, this isn't 10 to 1 in terms of least favourite to most favourite out of these. I'll probably start with the ones that the board game aspect is maybe a little bit more tenuous than the ones at the top. And so I'm going to start with God of War, and I appreciate there is a God of War card game, and I've got a sneaking suspicion in the back of my mind that there is a God of War minis game coming, but I may have just dreamt that. But that's the sort of thing that I'm thinking about, and this one is kind of a cop-out really, because any number of action RPGs could have been in this slot, and, you know, come on, have done Bloodborne, and that is getting really good ratings, and it's a game I'd like to try. It's a game I need to play a lot more of on the PS4, to be honest. And I figure God of War would work in a pretty similar way, particularly the newer God of War, the updated style, rather than the original, because they were far more action orientated in terms of the combo based gameplay. But for this one, it's primarily motivated for me by the minis. I think the minis would be outstanding in this one. And this is why I started with this one, because it is a bit tenuous, I admit. Going on to number 9. And this one is fairly low on the list, not because I don't think it would work, but because I think it would work. I think it could. There is a very fun game concept here. It's just that it's in a genre of board games that I haven't actually played, so I'm not, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not particularly knowledgeable in how the mechanics of that sort of game may work. But number 9 for me is Mirror's Edge. And Mirror's Edge is a video game where you live in a sort of dystopian future and you play a runner who's basically a courier, but because they are working off the grid from this, again, overruling corporations and whatnot, they're not just running up and down the streets, they're running through the rooftops, and it's very parkour heavy with a very distinctive, beautiful art style, of very pale colours, where a lot of the things you're running on are white, and then like the bits you can interact with if you're doing wall running or jumping over something, they come up in red, and it's very distinctive, and I thought it was absolutely gorgeous. And I think this could translate quite interestingly into a racing board game. And obviously we've got a lot of racing board games. As I mentioned before, I haven't actually tried them, but I think this could be a really interesting thing where, you know, each player is a runner for a different corporation, and you'd have this city board where you would start in different places depending which corporation you were working for, and then you had to use your parkour to navigate through the rooftops and everything to get around the city to deliver your package. It could have deck building elements in that in a sort of, so it has that programming aspect, like quirky circuits, for example, where you know you have a card saying you could do a wall run, or you can jump over a gap of 2 squares on the board or something, and each character would have its own skills that would be in the deck, and you would, you know, build your deck as you got stronger, so then you'd be able to combo more and do more intricate maneuvers around the board. And in my head, that sounds really fun and that it could work really well. How it would actually work in practice, I have no idea, and that's why it's relatively low at number 9. At number 8, I'm going to go with Breath of the Wild. And again, this isn't a game I love. I enjoyed it. I think I gave it an 8 out of 10. I certainly don't hold it in as high regard as most of the video gaming community. I found it really repetitive and a lot of busy work and a lot of empty space, to be honest. I mean, it felt like a game where they designed this massive, beautiful games world and then didn't really think about how they were going to fill it, and they did that afterwards, and they stretched a few concepts out too far, in my opinion. But I think the core philosophy of exploration with a very loose narrative fits very well with Seventh Continent, which I played through on the channel. And I think a Breath of the Wild Zelda themed Breath of the Wild, where you could have a bit more of a stronger narrative in terms of, instead of the curses, you could have, you know, the different races, I can't remember the divine beasts. So instead of a curse, it could be to fix or heal a divine beast, and then you could combine them into a campaign where you either go straight to Ganon, as you can in the video game for the end boss, or you do a campaign where you go around the whole land of Hyrule, heal all the divine beasts, and then tackle Ganon. And I think it would work really, really well, and I think it would sell hugely for a start, because Zelda is an incredibly popular IP and well justified. It's not a series I love because it's not my type of gameplay. I prefer a stronger narrative, but can't deny the core gameplay is very well designed. So I think it'd be very, very successful and really, really fun. It's just how you would deal with the combat in it. I'm not sure you would have the same health action deck as Seventh Continent. You may want to use some more RPG elements to control that side of things. But again, if you have any thoughts on that, comment down below. The next one I'm going to go for, which is number 7, is BioShock. And this game I absolutely adored when it came out. The narrative was fantastic. The City of Rapture is so iconic and fantastic. The lore and the history and everything that's linked to it is breathtaking, really. And I don't know, I always remember, I think at the time Heroes was really big as a TV series, and I absolutely loved Heroes, and I really wanted a video game at the time that gave you the sort of powers and everything you had in Heroes. I wanted to be Peter Petrelli using all these different powers and things. And BioShock gave me that. Through the plasmids and everything, you set someone on fire, so they jumped into a puddle to put the flames out, and then you'd use a lightning bolt to electrocute them while they're in the water, and you had all these fantastic combos, and you could, you know, cover a explosive canister in landmines and then use psychokinesis, I'll go with, and use that power to then throw this landmine covered explosive canister at a boss and just blow them to hell. And it was just so much fun, and the art style and everything, it's just got Awakened Realms written all over it for me. I mean, that may be swayed because in Aetherfields they have a mini that already looks a lot like a Big Daddy, and a Big Daddy is a phenomenal, one of the best designed characters I think I've ever seen. And also in terms of the gameplay, you know, the moral decisions you have in Bioshock, particularly the main one in terms of do you harvest the little sisters or not to make yourself stronger. So you're basically killing these little girls to make yourself stronger, or do you rescue them, which still makes you stronger but to a lesser extent to killing them does. And the first time I played Bioshock, I think my friend Chris, who has been on the channel, was there with me, and I sat there for about 20 minutes just trying to make that decision. I agonised over it for ages, and I would love to see that sort of thing translate into a board game space. Again, you can add the variety then in that Bioshock 2 had you playing as a Big Daddy, and you could expand the board game to that, which would obviously give you very different options in terms of your skills and your stats and everything. And again, I think it's just got huge potential for that narrative driven powers, moral, ethical dilemmas. I think Awakened Realms would really enjoy getting their teeth into that one. What are we on? Number 6 now, I think. And I'm going to go with The Last of Us, I think. Again, The Last of Us, similar to Bioshock in that it had a phenomenal narrative. I haven't played Last of Us 2 yet. I'm really excited for that. But The Last of Us is a game I absolutely loved. Really, really enjoyed. And I think it would translate really well because I really like the emphasis on stealth. And we've had a few stealth-based board games recently, and again, I'm not too knowledgeable on them because I haven't played them, but games like Sniper Elite and things, and I think Assassin's Creed may be a stealth-based one, but forgive me if I'm wrong, where you're obviously trying to make your way around the board without triggering enemies and things, and obviously that translates so perfectly to the video game where you're trying to get through buildings and environments without setting off the clickers, who are the sound-based zombies basically. And I mentioned Awakened Realms in the last one. They obviously did this War of Mine, which I featured on the channel, and when you're exploring locations in that, you have an exploration deck where you're going through, and it's measured on noise, so you regularly have to roll for the noise to see if you alert a resident or a citizen or a soldier or something that alert them to your presence. And again, I think that would translate really well to those tense moments. And again, you could use a similar sort of deck card system for negotiating through these clicker infested areas where you're rolling for the noise and things like that to get through those. And then you have the overarching narrative campaign, and then you can have the more combat orientated segments where you're against humans, again still primarily stealth, but you'd be assassinating people and using your bow and arrow and whatnot to try and take people out quietly, and it would be a really interesting type of puzzle, I think. On to number 5, and I'm going to go with Deadly Premonition. And again, this is one of my absolute favourite games. It's definitely in my top 10, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't work. From a technical perspective and a graphical perspective, the game is an absolute disaster. The controls are horrendous, and it shouldn't work. But because of the weirdness, and it's almost like the technical flaws actually complement it. It's really weird. But in terms of how it would translate to a board game, in the video game you play as a detective, and you're in this village trying to solve a series of murders basically. And again, I haven't played this style of game before. I've got one on order, but it hasn't arrived yet. But I look at things like, kind of like an escape room, or which I have played, or like the Sherlock Holmes games or Chronicles of Crime, where you have that crime solving element, and I think that would be really enjoyable in the Deadly Premonition universe. And in the game, he has this alter ego, this sort of dual personality issue where the detective regularly talks to his alter ego, and it's kind of like he's talking to you, the game player, through the TV, and that could be something that's really interestingly implemented, perhaps through an app where you would have it running in the background, and all of a sudden your alter ego could input feelings or anything depending on what you're doing at that time. I know some people don't like apps full stop, but I think if they're used in the right way, they can really aid the immersion. And as long as there was a way for the app to know what you're doing at that moment, to have that alter ego pipe up with a different perspective or some sort of clue that you may be missing, for example, I think would be a really interesting mechanic. And yeah, it's just got this fantastic, bizarre, twisted nature to it, where in a board game, I think the right developer would be able to really let their creative juices run wild, and I would love to see it. Now, what number am I on now? I'm on 1, 2, 4, I think. So number 4, I'm going to go with Dragon Age Origins. Again, phenomenal game, absolutely adore it. And I almost didn't include it in this list because it kind of felt like it would be bunched in with God of War in that sort of standard Bloodborne style exploration sort of game that they're doing more and more these days. But I think on reflection, I've thought about it a lot over the last few days, that there is enough difference in the gameplay to make it standalone. And the key to that is the group and the squad that you have. And again, I was thinking about Come On and Massive Darkness 2, which, although it was a game I cancelled, I absolutely loved the way that each character had its own gameplay mechanic for how it used its powers and its skills and things. And that would translate to any sort of squad-based RPG game where you have asynchronous powers and different abilities between the characters. But for me, I've gone with Dragon Age because, again, I love the lore and the environment of the world that you're in, and against you have to become a Grey Wardens, you have mages, the standard sort of fantasy tropes of elves and dwarves and humans, but they did it in a really interesting dynamic where elves are not, although they live in the forest, they're not these mystical, beautiful beings as such. They're almost treated as second-class citizens and slaves and things like that, and within the dwarven societies, they have their own caste system. So if you're a dwarf commoner, then you're looked down upon no matter how successful you become. You're never a highborn dwarf, for example. And yeah, so there's all these different interactions and things and different ways that people respond to you. And I haven't played a board game yet that's been able to really bring in that variability of NPC interaction as such. I'm sure there are out there. Please comment down below if there is, because I would love to play that sort of game, but it's just not something I've come across yet. And I think with Dragon Age there is huge potential for that. As I mentioned, obviously you have your squad of, your mages, your range fighters, your hammer users, your sword wielders, all the sort of fantasy tropes that you expect. And they could all have their own Massive Darkness 2 style mechanics for how they utilise those skills and abilities. And, the way they've designed it, I would really like to see Come On tackle this one. And, yeah, the variety of enemies is there as well, in that you're fighting giant spiders one minute, then skeletons, then the aforementioned Darkspawn, you've got big bad dragons, and, again, they can just go wild and they're not locked into one sort of overriding theme. There's a bit of everything in there, and I would be really excited to see that one come to life, really. The number 3, I'm going to go with Banner Saga. And I know there is a board game for Banner Saga, but as I mentioned in one of my previous videos, it's really infuriating that they didn't get it right for me personally, because it basically is an isometric boss battling board game on the TV, or on the console, sorry. And yet, when they made the board game of it, they focused entirely on the managing camp side, and the combat was just sort of this little puzzle that you did. And that's just a huge missed opportunity, and I would love to see someone tackle it again as that sort of Kingdom Death style boss battler, although not revolving necessarily around one enemy the way that Kingdom Death does, but you would have a number of dredge, and which are the main baddies. Obviously you could have human baddies and enemies, and lots of, again, moral, ethical dilemmas in the game, but you would be set up on a board and it'd be like a squad based boss battler with lots of asynchronicity on the player side, where each player has its own different speciality and different skills and powers that complement each other, but so with the enemies. And it'd be really interesting to see how you can manipulate that with the similar sort of attack decks that you see in Kingdom Death, and like Townsfolk Tussle has adapted, and other games that are coming like Primal Awakening and Monster Hunter World are starting to increase this a bit. And it would be interesting to see how that would play out when you're fighting against an archer dredge or a stone slinger dredge, and the healing, what they called soul singers, I think, and then the big bad dredge and everything. And the minis would look amazing, and the tactile nature of moving everything around the board, and you'd have this overarching campaign which would mirror the narrative of the games, where you then have those camp style interactions and managing the caravan and making sure you've got enough food, and you have the, as I mentioned earlier, the ethical moral dilemmas and whatnot. But that would almost be subservient to the combat as opposed to the other way round, which I think is the major misstep they made first time round. Number 2, and this one is one that I'm very, very excited about, but I am conscious that there's so many different things that I would love to do with this that it may well be that I'm trying to combine everything together and it just becomes a random jumble that wouldn't work, and you would have to separate it out perhaps and focus on certain core mechanics. But this one is Viva Pinata. And for those that don't know, Viva Pinata was a game that came out early in the Xbox 360 cycle, I believe, and did spawn a sequel. And you can play, I think, both of them in Rare Replay on the Xbox One if you've got access to that. And basically, the core of the game is you start and you are given control of this garden of a certain size, and you have to terraform it, for use of a better word, in order to make it an attractive place for these cute little creatures called pinatas, who will then want to come and live there. And they all have their different criterion things that you have to satisfy in order for your garden to appeal for them. So they might want a certain percentage of your garden to be covered in grass. They might want a certain percentage to be covered in water. They may want you to already have a certain type of piñata in your garden. You may have to have a certain type of building. And so you would have all these interesting, almost like a terraforming Mars style trackers in the way that they track the O2 and the temperature and the water. You would be tracking, the percentage of grass to water in your garden and things like that. And then, because the garden in the game, it's a set size, and you have to build your buildings, fences, paths, in order to help your helpers. You need, if you want the piñatas to breed, then they have to have a house. So you have to have room to build these houses in. You need, obviously, as I mentioned, the space to build ponds and things for water and plants. And I think that would translate to a really, really interesting polyamino element, where you have the different tiles for the different, not necessarily for the pinatas, because I don't think they would need their own tile, but for the pinata houses and for the paths and for the buildings. And then you'd have a worker placement element, perhaps with the assistants that you have who help with the feeding and things. And then you would have, again, similar to Terraforming Mars, you would have the card selection where you draw a card and it will have a certain type of pinata and it will have the conditions that you need to satisfy for it to visit. And then once you've got a pair of that type of pinata, then you would be given a condition of how to get them to breed, and you would have to go through this and balance it. And then, do you draw this more valuable pinata, but in order to get that pinata to visit your place, they have to eat one of your existing pinatas, who then perhaps can't breed. And it's that sort of trade-off and strategy between, okay, do I want to sacrifice that decent point scoring set of a breeding pair in order to attract this more valuable pinata, which will give me more points at the end? And I think there's an awful lot of different elements. I mean, the worker placement you wouldn't necessarily need. That maybe is a step too far. But in terms of the card set collection for the pinatas and the buildings, combined with the polyamino garden style, and also you have these sort of evil pinatas. I can't remember the name for them now, but they're sort of red and crazy when they come in, and you have to. They would come out and cause damage to your garden and things like that. And I just think it would be really, really fun. The art style is gorgeous, and it would be really, really beautiful on the table, I think. And yeah, that is one. Probably, although I put it at number 2, it's probably the one that I have been the most excited about thinking about it. Whereas my number 1 is one that I'm confident would work brilliantly, and it is just a game that I absolutely love and would just love to see on the table. And that game is Mass Effect. I absolutely adore Mass Effect. Mass Effect trilogy is, I count it as one. It's because it's a cop-out, it's a cheat. I don't want to separate them out. But I count the Mass Effect trilogy in my top 5 games of all time. Absolutely love it. And although I haven't played the game I'm basing this on, in terms of the board game, I still really, really want to see this happen. And that would be Mass Effect. And it would basically be like a reskin of Star Wars Rebellion. And that game, Star Wars Rebellion, is so high on my wish list because, again, I love the license and I love that. I don't often like competitive games, but the scale of it and really, really appeals to me. And with Mass Effect having one player control Commander Shepard and recruiting crewmates and building alliances with different species and going around the board building the forces in the army while the other player is controlling the Reapers and working from the shadows, so you would have your shadow agents and manipulate the Geth initially and things like that. And throughout the course of the game, then you would get to a point where you have to make the decision to sort of unveil yourselves as the overriding threat and things like that. I think there is so much potential for that game, and it is one I desperately want to see happen. Because, it's a wonderful, wonderful universe they created in Mass Effect. And, Andromeda didn't particularly score well, and I'm playing that at the moment. I think it's fine, it's a good game, but it's certainly not at the level of the original trilogy, and I wouldn't include it in this game. You can maybe have it as an expansion down the line, perhaps. But yeah, I just really, really, really want to see a Star Wars Rebellion style Mass Effect, galaxy spanning, huge war game on my table. Somebody make that happen for me, because I will be eternally grateful. And that is my top 10 video game adaptations that I want to see. As I mentioned earlier, please comment down below with your thoughts, feelings, whether you agree, whether you disagree, what other games you'd rather see, and the sort of mechanics and things, because I love talking about this sort of stuff. So please indulge me. And with that, I'm going to end the video there. So thank you very much for watching. Look after yourself, stay safe, and have a good one. Thank you. Bye bye now.